Very good. Well, I think we'll make a start. Well, as many of you, I suspect by now will be aware, I'm the founding director of a project called Insiders Outsiders, which originally took the form of a year-long nationwide face-to-face arts festival, paying tribute and examining in more nuanced sort of detail the rich and pervasive contribution of refugees from Nazi Europe to this country's culture across all art forms. So it was pretty ambitious, and it became much bigger than I had ever anticipated. And then came COVID, and blessing in disguise, perhaps, I was forced to rethink how one might continue the celebration. And the obvious answer was to go online, and hence an ongoing program of free online events, of which this event this evening forms part. And indeed, Alan Powers, who I'll be introducing in a minute, has already given a number of wonderful talks on topics related to architecture and design for the project. So my thanks to Alan for past contributions. Good. Well, I'm an art historian by training and profession, not an architectural historian. So it was to Alan that I naturally turned when I heard about this recently published new book on Peter Moro and partners. So without further ado, I think I will first of all just ask you all to stay muted, but I'm sure you know that by now. The event will be recorded. I will say more about that later. And obviously you know the ropes, questions through the chat if you wouldn't mind, although given the relatively small numbers, we might perhaps ask you to unmute yourselves if it seems appropriate towards the end of the proceedings. So Alan in turn will introduce our main speaker, Alistair Fair, the author of this new book. But let me just say a few brief words about Alan, who I suspect is known to many of you already. He's based in London, teaches, writes and curates mainly about mid-20th century British art, architecture and design. As he puts it rather nicely, he says painting, drawing and printmaking are an occasional indulgence. But actually, Alan, I've seen reproductions of some of your work, and you're actually pretty accomplished in that department as well. He's the author of numerous books, among them surveys of 20th century architecture and monographs on figures such as John Piper, Eric Ravilius, Enid Marx and the émigré architect Serge Chermayeff. And perhaps most relevant in a slightly more oblique way, well, no, not really, actually, definitely relevant to tonight's event, a wonderful and wide-ranging book called Bauhaus Goes West, published by Thames and Hudson quite recently in 2019. So Alan, it's my great pleasure to hand over to you to preside over tonight's proceedings.
Well, thank you, Monica. It's a great pleasure because I have various connections with this book. I'll introduce the speaker, Alistair, in a moment, but first of all, to talk about the publishing background to this. The book is the 19th in a series, which first published its first volumes in 2009. And this was developed through a collaboration of the 20th Century Society, the conservation body equivalent to the Victorian Society, with, at that time, RABA Publishing and what was then known as English Heritage, the part that's now become Historic England, the sort of history archives listing part. And this was a formula that worked. The underlying idea was that books really still matter, and particularly in the world of conservation. If there's a book, people still treat it as being something more important and objective than any other medium of communication. And it also works very well, I think, for spreading the word. There's simply the idea that this architect exists and matters, that people have felt it worthwhile to invest in such a project. So the aim always was to try and find architects who'd never had a book before, but who deserved one, of which there are surprisingly many. We have broken that rule from time to time and done architects who have, as it were, been done before, but always for what we felt was a good reason, that there wasn't the book that, for example, in my mind, when we conceived them, they are only a bit over 30,000 words, but with plenty of pictures, that this would be something suitable for a student wanting to do an essay, as well as for a reader sitting down comfortably and perhaps finishing it at one sitting. And also that perhaps it would mean that the authors didn't take too many years over working on it. So all these things have been accomplished with a wide range of titles covering modern architecture and traditional architecture before the Second World War and after the Second World War. So Peter Moro covers both before and after the war. He was of that generation, and as Alistair will no doubt tell us, had a very lucky break to get a job in the late 1930s, a very fine and really important house that he built. And what you can see here is his own house in Blackheath with the spindly spire poking up in the night sky. So we shall be hearing more about Peter Moro. Alistair Fair is one of the leading historians of 20th century architecture, with a specialism in Britain and also a specialism in theatre design of the recent past and going further back, on which he has published quite widely, and he teaches at the University of Edinburgh, as you can see. So it's a very great pleasure to introduce him.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you, Monica, for asking me to contribute to your series, and thanks to everyone who's joined us this evening. So this talk presents a book which, as Alan has said, it was published last autumn as part of this series. It's a book that many people have helped with, not least Alan and also Elaine Harwood, and many others who've supplied information and have helped with images, photographs and plans. I'm very grateful to all of those people. And I should say as well that this book is very deliberately called Peter Moro and Partners. That's because I firmly believe in architecture as a collaborative enterprise. Peter Moro was the undisputed nucleus around which the projects that I'm going to discuss were all centred. His role in this architectural practice was critical, and it can't be underestimated. But at the same time, his colleagues in practice also made important contributions to these buildings, as did specialist consultants and also often the practice's clients. Now, in writing this book, I was a bit nervous. This image appears in Peter Moro's archive, and it's a quotation from Edmund Burke, reflecting on life, but for Peter Moro, reflecting on the reality of architectural practice. And it talks about, worst of all, the presumptuous judgment of the ignorant amongst upon their designs. I hope my judgments tonight and in the book are not what Peter Moro would have considered the presumptuous opinions of the ignorant. So what I'm going to do today is to say a little bit about Moro's early life, and I'll then move on to talk about some of the key buildings that he was involved in. We'll see that Moro was a modernist. He believed in the idea of a modern architecture which avoided historical revival. He believed in an architecture rooted in a close understanding of function, but his ideal was also an art. In other words, Moro sought an enriched modern architecture, one which was rigorous and functional, but which also used forms and materials to deliberately artistic effect. And that becomes particularly clear in the theatres for which he particularly became known in the post-war decades. But we'll see these ideas running through many of the buildings that I'm going to talk about. So here we have a photograph of Peter Moro in the late 1940s, sitting on a Perspex chair of his own design, a demonstration project for ICI of the possibilities of Perspex. He was born in 1911 in Heidelberg in Germany. Peter Moro's father was a well-known doctor and a professor of paediatric medicine at the university there. And it's after Moro's father that the Moro reflex, demonstrated by newborn babies, was named. Peter Moro's father had moved to Heidelberg from Slovenia, which was then in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Meanwhile, his mother was from Vienna. Both of Peter Moro's parents were artistic. Indeed, there was an artistic streak in the family generally. His cousins included Rudolf Bing, who became an impresario at the Charlottenburg Opera and later moved to Glyndebourne, and who also co-founded the Edinburgh Festival. The young Peter Moro similarly excelled at art, but his father suggested that he should become an architect in order to put his talents to practical use. Before Moro was able to begin studying architecture, he laboured for 6 months on a building site in Heidelberg. Despite his family's affluence, he felt that he fitted in well, and I quote, "I was proud not to be recognised as one of those chaps who had to do their practical year. The others just accepted me as one of them," he said. It was tough work, but Moro was proud of the carpentry and bricklaying skills that he learnt during this period on site. All that completed, he then moved to Stuttgart to study architecture. The curriculum was relatively traditional, learning about the historical architectural styles. But Moro was able to visit the recently completed Weissenhof-Siedlung housing estate on the edge of Stuttgart. And you see one of the buildings on that estate here on the slide, including works by people like Le Corbusier. The estate was intended as a showcase of the latest architecture. The photograph on the right shows Moro's notes on his visit to the estate, including him outside one of the houses there. Now, Moro transferred from Stuttgart to continue his studies in Berlin. This was the beginning of the 1930s. He became involved in anti-fascist networks. However, the rise of the Nazis meant the end of his studies in Germany. Around this time, Moro discovered that one of his grandmothers had converted to Catholicism from the Jewish faith. This was news to him, and he had declared that he believed that he didn't have any Jewish ancestry. So when this news came out, Moro was summoned to a hearing of sorts and was asked to leave the university in Berlin. He left during 1934. The reputation of his father was such that he was given a reference which would have allowed him to continue studying architecture elsewhere in Germany. However, he felt that he wished to leave, and he transferred to Zurich, where he continued his studies under Otto Salvisberg, then emerging as one of the leading modern architects in Switzerland. And again, here is one of Salvisberg's buildings dating from that period. Moro enjoyed the international character of Zurich, as well as the progressive character of the university and the instruction that he got from people like Salvisberg in modern architecture. He graduated in 1936. However, he chose not to return to Germany, not surprisingly, and chose instead to travel to Britain. A friend of Peter Moro's father's promised him an introduction to Walter Gropius, the former director of the Bauhaus Design School, who was now working in London. And so Moro travelled to London via Ostend, almost missing the ferry when he fell asleep on the train. He eventually arrived in London and met a friend who took him to lodgings in Palmer's Green. But on the next day, Moro presented himself at Gropius's office in London. However, Gropius looked him up and down and said, "There are no jobs available here. I have no work for you." Moro was, not surprisingly, despondent at this news and feared that he would have to return to Germany. But by chance, he met a fellow graduate from Zurich, and that graduate was working for Berthold Lubetkin's practice, Tecton. Moro was given somewhere to stay, a meal at the Lion's Corner House, where, anxious not to impose, he chose porridge. Now, Tecton, and you see there High Point Flats here on the slide, was one of the most significant modernist practices working in 1930s London, with a strong reputation. Moro was given an interview on the strength of the introduction from his Zurich friend, and Tecton Lubetkin took Moro on, telling the Home Office that Moro was a specialist in staircase design in order to secure him a work permit. Moro was especially closely involved with the design of the High Point 2 flats in North London. And you see that block on the left-hand side of the image here. The building to the right is the first block of High Point flats, designed slightly earlier in the 1930s by Tecton. The difference between these two buildings illustrates the ways in which Tecton's approach was changing during the late 30s. Whereas the first High Point block on the right of the image is notable for its smooth rendered surfaces. High Point 2 on the left mixes different finishes, including brick, glass blocks, and rendered surfaces. And the elevation is more strongly modelled. It projects forward, it's cut into. It delights in a greater complexity. There are greater contrasts inside and out. That complexity extends even to the inclusion of the caryatid or human-like figures, which you see there holding up the entrance canopy, copied from ancient Greece. Now, Moro worked on various aspects of High Point 2, including the stairs in the duplex flats. Moro, of course, being presented as a staircase specialist. This was a key period in his professional development. He learnt about feet and inches, as well as the mysteries of British construction. He improved his English in the process, not least through the efforts of his colleague William Tatton Brown, who would place a telephone call and then hand the receiver to Moro and disappear from the room, leaving Moro with no choice but to speak with whoever was on the other end of the line in English. Looking back, though, Moro recalled that he had learnt more from this period with Lubetkin and Tecton than in all his years of architectural study. He reflected that in Zurich, he'd learnt the basic recipes for building modern architecture. But he said, and I quote, "It was Lubetkin who first opened my eyes to the real meaning of architecture and art based on reason." Now, during 1937, Moro was invited to join the MARS group, and MARS stands for Modern Architectural Research. This was a network of modernist architects committed to the evolution of contemporary architecture. Many of the leading designers in London were members, and so Moro later remembered that being invited to join was what he called a tremendous leg up. He was, he said, one of the boys now, feeling accepted in London. With his colleague, the designer Gordon Cullen, he made a contribution to the MARS Group's exhibition of modern architecture, which was staged at the start of 1938. And it's the screen that you see here, evoking the Vitruvian trilogy, commodity, firmness, and delight, these aspects that Vitruvius and the Renaissance writers felt were central to architecture. And again, those ideas of commodity, firmness, and delight we might see as things running through Moro's work, an architecture which was practical, logical, well-engineered, but also pleasant to look at and to experience. So Moro remains with Tecton, with Lubetkin, into 1938. But at that time, he then leaves Tecton and switches into independent practice. And the key project was the house you see here on the slide, and which Alan mentioned in his introduction, a house on the Sussex coast called Harbour Meadow. It was designed with Richard Llewellyn Davis as the co-designer. Davis would go on to become a prominent architect in the post-war years, but in the late 1930s, he was a student at the Architectural Association, as well as being Peter Moro's flatmate. One day, Davis returned home, and he reported to Moro that he'd bumped into a woman who'd come into the Architectural Association, where Davis was studying, looking for an architect. Davis said it seemed that the woman thought that the Architectural Association was a kind of labour exchange for architects, and it was a place that you went to if you wanted an architect. Davis said, "Oh, well, I'm only a student." And on relaying this to Moro, Moro was a bit disappointed. "Oh," he said, "you could have told her about me. I'm fully qualified." Well, Moro and Richard Llewellyn Davis went to meet this woman, Pauline Tors, and her husband, George, who was a wealthy industrialist. And the two of them went through a list of possible designers for the house that George and Pauline Tors wanted to build, sort of gradually strategically crossing each of the contenders off before finally putting themselves forward. And they were taken on. And as you see here, the result was Harbour Meadow, which was completed in 1940. Now, in plan, this house consists of two wings connected by the hall and the staircase, and I've highlighted those two wings here in orange. That, to the rear of the site, overlooking the gardens and the coast, contains the main living rooms, with the master bedroom suite above. The wing to the front houses the service areas on the ground floor and the bedrooms above that, and they're connected by this grand curving staircase and full height hall between them. As you can see, this is a grand house, one that was to be run with a retinue of servants. The approach to the house is deliberately asymmetric or non-axial. I've drawn it with these blue arrows onto the slide for you. You approach through the trees, you get out your car, the chauffeur takes the car off to that triple garage on the left of the slide. You enter a courtyard space through a kind of proscenium arch, but you then have to turn right to get into the house. And then when you're in the entrance hall at the foot of the stairs, you have to turn again to reach the main living rooms. This lack of symmetry echoes the turns and the changes in level that we see in the entrance hall of Tecton's first High Point block, which Moro would have known well. Indeed, Moro later wrote to Lubetkin of his particular liking for the sequence of spaces that you encounter as you move into that first High Point block. It doesn't give everything away in one go. You have to change direction. You have to climb steps. You have to turn once again in order to fully experience it all. So here on the left is that entrance courtyard at Harbour Meadow, passing through the proscenium arch to reach the court, and you can then see the glazing adjacent to the door just there in the middle of the image. I'd like you to note a few things, in particular, the contrasting textures that we can see here. The rubble stone wall across the front of the building, the smooth brick of the main body of the house rising up behind, the even smoother concrete cornice or the concrete frames of the proscenium arch and the windows. There's an enjoyment of texture here, as well perhaps as a deliberate ambiguity. At first glance, it's not clear whether that rubble stone wall is an older structure which has been incorporated into the house, the proscenium arch perhaps smashed through it, or that window on the right punching back the other way. Overall, what we have is an elevation made up of a series of layers. A sense of depth that's created by this is amplified by the projecting roofline, which, as you can see, casts a shadow over the building, as well as the dark shadow gap at the base of the building, a classic Tecton move. The glazed box, as I say, thrusts forward, connecting the house with the wall and thrusting into the space of the entrance driveway. The garden front is similarly complex and similarly layered. Notice the dark brickwork of that double height recessed section. This dark brickwork adds depth, but again we have layers. The dark brick in the background, the balustrading in the midground, the glazed window projecting forwards. George Tors, as I noted, was an industrialist. He worked in the steel industry, and these connections meant that many bespoke components were used throughout the house, including these elegantly turning balustrade posts on the main staircase. Throughout, changes in materials and levels are used to denote different areas. We're looking here at the main living room, and we should note the way in which above the seating area, the ceiling drops down and it's ribbed. This is then mirrored in the carpet below, creating this defined sitting area within the larger space of the room. And that timber-clad column on the left-hand side further adds to the sense of definition in this space. There's also an ambiguity in the dining room. An interesting space, this was designed by Moro's colleague Gordon Cullen, presenting the world beyond as almost a living picture. You look through the yellow glass towards the sea, towards the estuary, presented as this kind of observed reality, but also striking an interesting note of architectural complexity, perhaps akin to those classical human-like caryatids at High Point. Because here, within this really modern environment, we have this classical, almost Regency-like frame. Now, Harbour Meadow was extensively covered in the architectural press on its completion in 1940. Indeed, the architectural reviewers, photographers Dell and Wainwright were mistaken by local people as possible spies. There were rumours that the shape of the building had been deliberately designed as a symbol for invading German bombers. But what of Moro in this period? Well, early in the war, he was interned as a supposed enemy alien, so-called. He was interned on the Isle of Man, and there with others, he set up quite a vibrant kind of almost adult education program. He wrote to the Liverpool School of Architecture to secure textbooks which could be used in the internment camp. Finally, though, he was released. And on release from internment, his career took two forms. First, he became a well-regarded tutor at the Regent Street School of Architecture in London. Trevor Dannett, who went on to become a noted architect himself, was one of the first students to be taught by Moro. And Dannett recalled the respect the students had for Moro because of the quality of the house at Harbour Meadow. In parallel with his teaching, Moro worked with designers such as Misha Black and Robin Day on propaganda and commercial exhibitions, such as you see here. And this was a productive field of work which occupied Moro right through to the end of the 1940s. It taught him a lot about how atmosphere and meaning could be created on a shoestring. It taught him about the ways that people could be encouraged to move through space by means of views and lighting, rather than by lots of signage and ropes. And it taught him to think about the way that spaces might be lit and finished. We see one of those exhibitions here, the Jet exhibition of 1946, and you can see the way in which light is very deliberately orchestrated within this space. And I'd like you also to notice the panels on the right-hand side. The form of them echoes that of aeroplane wings. And parts of them are then angled at 45 degrees to create these views through the space. And this idea of views, the way in which atmosphere could be created by lighting and materials, all of this would become very important in Moro's post-war career and his work designing arts buildings. Now, his post-war specialism in the arts came about through his involvement in the Royal Festival Hall. In 1948, Moro was approached to take a leading role in the design team delivering the Festival Hall. This was to be one of the centerpieces of the 1951 Festival of Britain, but it was to be a permanent element of the festival, a legacy of the festival, a replacement for the Queen's Hall, which had been damaged by bombing. The hall was planned for a site on the south bank of the River Thames from 1947 onwards. And the basic design owes much to the London County Council's chief architect, Robert Matthew, who had travelled in Scandinavia and was influenced by the design of recent arts buildings in Sweden. Matthew, however, having generated the basic concept, handed over the delivery and the execution of the project to his newly appointed deputy, Leslie Martin. Peter Moro was brought in as what was described as an associated architect to work particularly on the interiors. Quite how Moro became involved in this project isn't entirely clear, but my suspicion is that it's through Richard Llewellyn-Davies, his co-designer from Harbour Meadow. And that's because Richard Llewellyn-Davies had worked with Leslie Martin during the Second World War, designing stations and other buildings for the London, Midland and Scottish Railway. And my suspicion is that Martin asked Davis for a suggestion of who to appoint, and Moro's name perhaps came up in discussion. Although it's also possible that Martin would have known Moro's work with Misha Black and Robin Day on the exhibitions. Whatever the case was, Moro was taken on. Here we see the design team, Moro there on the left, then Leslie Martin, Robert Matthew, and the LCC's designer Edwin Williams, who again played a key role in delivering this building and who was responsible for many of the services as well as working with the building teams. Moro joked that in a group photograph such as this, it was always best, he said, to stand on the right of the group, because he said this meant that when the caption was written left to right, your name would appear first. And there's perhaps a sense of Moro's sense of humour in that little story. Now, the Festival Hall building, we see it here as completed in 1951, was originally smaller than it is now, and it looked a little different. To the rear of the site, you see in the photograph on the top left, space was left for an anticipated extension containing a second concert hall and art gallery. And so that side of the building was faced with temporary asbestos cladding. The front on the right there facing the river was originally slightly further away from the riverbank than is now the case. It was extended in the 1960s. And at that time in the 1960s, the sides of the building were also altered. You can see again on the left what the original sides of the building were like, rather more complex than what we've ended up with subsequently, with contrasts between tiles, patterned tiles at that, stone and glass blocks. And again, an elevation that steps forward and back. It delights in a certain complexity. Moro's hand is felt largely in the interiors. Here, he worked with a hand-picked team of his former students. He was allowed to choose this team, to appoint them. He joked that because he had taught them all, they all shared his ideas. He said, I have brainwashed them. There will be no arguments. Indeed, there wasn't time for arguments. Moro and his team were appointed in 1948. The building had to be ready for the Festival of Britain in 1951. And of course, it was being realised at a time of post-war austerity and shortages. So this was not an easy context in which to be building a major public structure such as this. The key feature of the foyers, as you see here, is the way that they are a continuous space which flows around the main mass of the concert hall itself. And that's perhaps brought out a little more clearly in the axonometric drawing there on the left of the slide. The concert hall is raised up above ground level. This means that the foyers flow not just around the sides of it, but also underneath it. And this was a clever move on the part of the design team because it made the most of a relatively compact site and kept the building relatively contained. It also meant that the concert hall is isolated from the sound and the vibrations of trains on the adjacent railway line. So this concept, it's known as the egg in a box, if you like, for the way in which the concert hall itself is protected like an egg in an egg box from what's around it. Now, there are a number of entrances into the building as originally conceived, but as you can see on the left there, I've highlighted what was intended as the main entrance. And the thing to note is that this is on the side of the building. You might expect it to be in the middle of the riverfront. And there certainly were entrances on the riverfront, but as I say, this main entrance is to the side. So that's already starting to subvert the symmetry that you might typically associate with older public buildings. As you come in through that door, you have the view that we see on the right-hand side. Now, this is the view as it is now, but it gives you a sense of what happens. There is a short, broad flight of stairs up to the cloakroom level. And once you get there, you have the choice either of continuing up the stairs on the left that you can see, or you can check your coat at the cloakroom on the right. And from there, a second staircase leads up to the foyers. And the things to note about this are these changes in directions and levels, the sort of thing that we've seen Moro doing already and that he's picked up from Tecton. The idea that you don't just have a kind of grand single axial procession as you go into this sort of building, but you have to pass through it. You change level, you turn, you change direction. As you finally arrive in the foyer, the slope of the auditorium rake is immediately evident above your head. Indeed, fluorescent lighting, as you can see here, was used to emphasize it. This was one of the very first uses of lighting in this way for architectural emphasis in Britain. You can note as well the way in which this is a continuous space, a large space, but it's broken down into smaller areas by the use of different ceiling materials, different kinds of lighting, different flooring materials. And the movement of people through this deliberately animates and adds to these spaces. Again, views are absolutely critical. Screens are often made of glass, as are the balustrades, in order not to interrupt those vistas, those views through the space. The carpets were designed by Peter Moro and Leslie Martin as part of a programme of bespoke furnishings which ran throughout the building. Here on the right, we have one of the chairs designed by Robin Day, a long-time Moro collaborator there, and the carpets, the pattern described as net and ball. The net refers to that wavy line, which you might liken perhaps to the movement of the River Thames, but which I think also represents sound as you might see it on an oscilloscope, a sort of a sound wave, very appropriate for a building devoted to music. And in that respect, it echoes the work of the Festival Pattern Group elsewhere in the Festival of Britain. The Festival Pattern Group was a body of designers who took their inspiration from chemistry. They used the forms of chemical elements to inspire them. So I think Moro's doing something similar here, this kind of scientific representation of a sound wave creating the base pattern of this carpet. The circle, the ball, was by Leslie Martin, who apparently picked up an apple off his desk and set it down on Moro's drawing. Here we have the auditorium, a rectangular hall with a single gallery. Its modulated wall surfaces and the ceiling to some extent disguise that regularity. Key thing here was the opinions, the ideas of the acoustic consultants who were closely involved in the design of this space. The balconies angled towards the stage so that everyone gets a good view. This is not so much the seeing and being seen of a traditional theatre box, the idea that you sit in these balconies and you get in the boxes and you get a good view of the stage. And their curved form, again, looking back, I think, to the work of Tecton and particularly the balconies at high points. Overall, the atmosphere is warm and rich, with dark colours, rich wood panelling, lighting, textiles, all playing a role within this space. Now, the significance of the Festival Hall cannot be overstated. The Festival of Britain was, of course, an event of national and international prominence. The Festival Hall itself was the first major non-austerity public building to be completed in Britain since before the Second World War, so more than a decade. It offered a new model for public architecture, which would be hugely influential in the post-war years. It's certainly traditional in some respects, the idea that high culture is of innate value. It's perhaps even paternalistic in seeking to encourage an appreciation of such culture. But it reflected a new egalitarian approach. It suggested new models of citizenship and participation, a democratic architecture that would be highly important. And for Moro, it was a key step in his career. He returned to independent practice in 1951. Early projects included television studios on the Kingsway in London for Associated Rediffusion, And also this, a school for the London County Council in Lewisham, Fairlawn School, completed 1957. Once more, we have a sequence of experiences as you move across the site and into the building. A sequence of steps and ramps leads to the entrance into the school, which you see in the middle of the slide there. To the left of that entrance, 4 infants' classrooms articulated as separate objects. To the right of the entrance, we have the hall, and you see the brick end wall of the hall bathed in sunlight there. That leads back to the glazed block at the rear of the site, which accommodates the juniors' classrooms. Just as at Harbour Meadow, the different functions, the different parts of the school are pulled apart and clearly articulated in these separate blocks. There's almost a sort of constructivist sculptural quality to this. In some respects, it echoes the artwork by Victor Passmore, which you see there on the left-hand side, which was installed in the infants' corridor. There's a crispness to the building, an absolute clarity about it. It's clear what is structure, what is infill. Different structural elements were consistently colour-coded. And as I say, there's a journey across the site, the steps and ramps that lead to the entrance, and then the stair that you see on the right there within the hall, which links the school hall with the junior block higher up the hill. That idea of moving through space once more that we've already noted. Further school commissions followed for Moro and his growing number of colleagues, notably Highcliffe School on the edge of Leicester, which we see here. It was completed in 1964. Again, we have a disaggregated plan which breaks apart the different elements of the school, as you see there on the right. But there's an absolute consistency about this. These octagons are ruthlessly applied throughout the plan. A big octagon for the assembly hall, the classrooms, meanwhile, a cluster of smaller octagons gathered around it. It suggests the idea of a school community made up as a series of smaller groups. During this period, Moro also kept up his contact with Robin Day, and the pair worked together on this building, a showroom for Hilly Furnishings in London's West End. The Hilly Company had been founded early in the 20th century, and after the Second World War turned increasingly to modern design, working with Robin Day on a complete overhaul of its products and image. Day not only designed them a logo, but also oversaw their publicity material. The idea was that there would be a consistent modernity to Hilly's products and its branding. In many ways, the Hilly building represents an attempt to do something similar. It gives you an image of the Hilly Company, the epitome of modernity, but it also supplies a sympathetic backdrop for their projects. And I think as well, it's an interesting example of trying to do something special with what might seem a very ordinary building type, a glazed office tower. That idea of a glazed tower block was becoming increasingly common in the early 1960s. But Moro and his colleagues handled the design with sophistication and care, thinking very carefully about how the different elements would join together, and again, creating little moments of delight, such as the spiral stair that you see there on the right, with these ropes hung from the ceiling, a kind of display of engineering virtuosity, which on the one hand was there out of necessity, but also creates something interesting to look at. Now, that idea of taking something ordinary and doing something special with it is also very apparent in the house which Moro designed for his family at 20 Blackheath Park in southeast London. This was completed in 1957, and it remained Moro's home until his death in 1998. And he described it using terms such as ordinary and modest. And in some ways, this might be true. It uses ordinary materials such as brick, tile, timber, but it's also sophisticated in its layout and its detailing. As you can see here from the model, the house has 2 stories overall. It is in effect made up of 4 parts, because each of the main floors is actually split level. This allows for a full width clear story, that narrow slot of glazing running across at roof level there. The main living areas and the bedrooms are upstairs, both to get good views, but also privacy. Below them, we have service spaces such as a workshop and a garage. To the street, a layered elevation of brick and timber, cut into, pulled back and forth once more to create that sense of depth that we've already seen in earlier projects. The door is one of my favourite details, and I've given you an image of that on the right of the slide. Notice the way in which the dark band with the number of the house runs across the timber door and the glazing to the side. It suggests an interplay of shapes and materials, which is then echoed of the elevation itself. And I also particularly like that big letterbox, all the better for architectural magazines. On the garden front, the way that the upper level appears to float over the ground floor echoes some of the interwar villas by Le Corbusier, but the combination of timber cladding and painted brick creates a more diverse organic feeling than one might see in the smooth rendered surfaces of Le Corbusier's 1920s villas. Inside, the front door gives onto a long stair, and you rise up through the building to the upper landing, and you turn into the living room, which you see on the left there, as it was at the time of Moro's death in 1998. Its open planning drew much contemporary debate. We have the living area at the front of the photograph there, beyond it, Moro's study. Separated from the living area by the fireplace, which you see set between those 2 columns of white painted brick. And originally there was also a dividing unit which ran across between the fireplace and the window wall, clearly delineating the different spaces, but also allowing views through. And in that respect, even the fireplace, you can see, allows views above and through the fireplace. So that idea of separation and connection, which we've seen in some of the other projects tonight, very much alive and well here. Moro's achievement at Blackheath Park overall was a comfortable home, which feels familiar, but also suggests new ways of living. It's rigorous, it's really controlled in its design and its details. It humanises the spirit of earlier modernist villas. Fundamentally, it appeals to the essence of architecture. This is not a 1950s design through the appearance of lots of Festival of Britain patterning. It transcends those contemporary fashions by thinking about rhythm, proportion, materials, and views, the experience of this architecture. Now, as we move into the 1960s, council housing formed an increasingly important part of Moro's practice workload. Much of this work was led by his colleague, Michael Mellish. Their first major scheme was the one you see here in the East End of London, where an area to the north of Cable Street was swept away and replaced by a pair of quadrangles containing maisonettes and a single tower block for vertical emphasis. Relatively straightforward overall. Each of the blocks contains just a single design of flat. The elevations you see on the right, simple in their concrete banding and their red brick finish. But as the practice's expertise in council housing developed, its approach became more complex and more sophisticated. And we see that in a sequence of jobs that they undertook for the London Borough of Southwark. At Hamilton Square, for example, just near Guy's Hospital, completed 1973, we have basically 2 ranges of buildings. You can perhaps see that best in the section there on the right. 2 linear blocks set either side of a courtyard and playground. But unlike the block we saw a minute ago near Cable Street, where each was just a simple cube, each of the blocks at Hamilton Square is fractured apart. A footpath, a walkway, cuts through the middle, as you can see there in the section. And we have a range of different sizes of flats, small, medium, and large. And those flats, in some cases, actually step across the walkway. So there's a complexity to this. Each of the larger properties has several different levels. The aim was to give each of them not only an identifiable entrance, but also private outdoor space, whether that was a little piece of garden or a roof terrace or balcony. There's a generosity to this project which demonstrates the care and attention given to council housing at this time. And as I say, it was one of a number of projects undertaken in the London Borough of Southwark, the type that we might call high density, low rise, an approach to housing which gained in prominence during the 1970s. The high density, low rise housing built by the London Borough of Camden is particularly well known. But Southwark's examples are interesting as well, and the sequence of projects by Moro and his colleagues are an important part of that story. They successfully reinterpreted the scale, the sense of association of the traditional London street. As you see here in Peckham, the start of the 1980s, each home has an identifiable entrance opening off the walkways. These walkways provide space for neighbourly chat, and as you see in my more recent photo there, plant pots as well. By the early 1980s, Peter Moro and his colleagues were recognised by critics and their peers for their expertise in making the most of these difficult sites and creating some really good council housing. But the severe reduction in council house construction after 1979 unfortunately put paid to this line of development. Now, one of the messages of the book is that Peter Moro and partners undertook a diverse range of work, and that this body of work as a whole deserves to be better known. But as I said earlier, it was for their theatres that they became particularly well regarded in the post-war decades. And it's with those theatres that I'm going to end tonight. The Festival Hall was the foundation of this work, because it gave Moro a reputation as a specialist in the design of arts buildings. At the end of the 1950s, as theatre building began to gather pace in post-war Britain, the fact that Moro had worked on an arts building gave him something of an advantage over many of his colleagues and contemporaries. His expertise was recognised not only in the buildings that he designed, but he also advised the Arts Council. And he was a member of key professional networks, such as the Association of British Theatre Technicians. The first of these theatres was Nottingham Playhouse, commissioned in 1956 and opened in 1963. As one of the first of a wave of new regional theatres in post-war Britain, which was supported by public subsidy from the Arts Council and from local authorities. And that wave of post-war theatre building, which began in the 50s and lasted into the 80s, I've explored it in more detail in my earlier book, Modern Playhouses, which was recently reissued in paperback. Now, within this context of Britain's modern playhouses, the Nottingham Playhouse was quickly recognised as being one of the very best of these new theatres. Looking at it here, we see its geometric clarity. It's formed from the juxtaposition of various pure forms or volumes. The auditorium rises through the middle of the building, a concrete-faced cylinder or drum, and it rises above these cubic blocks housing the foyers, and the wing which slots into that, projecting forward, that houses the restaurant. There's a similar kind of play of solid and transparency to the Festival Hall. As you'll remember, the solid mass of the auditorium was enveloped by the foyers. And this play of transparency, the views that are being set up, are particularly clear at the ground floor, where the elevation is almost completely glazed and we can see the long stair rising up behind it. Indeed, that stair is deliberately long and shallow to dramatize that journey. In essence, the idea was that you would see this elevation with a consistently shifting backdrop of people moving around the building, effectively humanizing the architecture. But Moro didn't want to give everything away. The early designs, as you see on the left, at the upper level, have a long horizontal slot window. But as realized, we have the more complex pattern that you can see on the right, alternating square windows and vertical slits between them. If you squint at the image on the right, the horizontal slot is kind of still there, but it's been complicated and enriched with this pattern of squares and rectangles. And the result is that you get glimpses of what's going on behind, rather than having everything put on view for you straight away. Similarly, the foyers are a backdrop to the audience. Galleries and staircases waiting to be populated. The walls faced with board-marked concrete, a finish that is neutral to some extent in itself. It serves as a backdrop to the movement, the colour of the audience, but it is also a finish with its own degree of interest. Moro now not concerned with dressing up the building behind cladding or tiling, but seeking to draw out the fundamental property of this material and using that as a way to enrich and to enliven the space. The auditorium was understood by contemporaries to be particularly theatrical. And once again, we have functional requirements treated in such a way as to create something festive, theatrical, and artistic. The effect is largely down to the lighting, set behind the slats that line the wall. Those slats are there partly for acoustic reasons. They serve also to hide the wiring, the services. But by putting the lighting behind them, we have a kind of miniaturized representation of the pattern of the main elevation, which we saw a moment ago. So there's a kind of, again, a consistency running through the building, linking everything together. Nottingham led on to a sequence of further theatres and arts buildings, some of them on university campuses, such as the Gulbenkian Centre at Hull, which was designed for the teaching of drama, or the Riverside Theatre at Coleraine in Northern Ireland on the campus of what was then known as the New University of Ulster, and conceived both for the use of students and the wider public. Moro and his colleagues also turned their hands to the restoration and adaptation of historic buildings, Bristol's Old Vic, which they worked on at the end of the 1960s and was completed in 1972, where the historic auditorium was refurbished and restored. A new entrance was created through the historic Cooper's Hall, which you see there in the image on the left. And a modest building was constructed alongside, housing extended foyers and also the studio space that you see on the right. A space which was designed to be flexible, but to still have character, created by its rigorous geometries and the way, again, that it invites occupation. The 70s proved a little frustrating in some respects as far as arts buildings were concerned. Some major projects never came to fruition, including a major arts centre proposed for the London Borough of Hounslow at Brentford, which, as originally conceived, would have had several auditoria. And there's an echo of its riverside setting in these porthole-like windows, perhaps. Moro was particularly sad that this project didn't happen. But some of the ideas from it appear in one of their last major theatres, Plymouth Theatre Royal, which was completed in 1982. If we look on the left-hand side here, you can see the exterior of the building. Again, there is a consistency and a rigour to this, an attempt not to dress up the building in any respect. The blockwork says what it is, but there is still a note of richness in bronze cladding and the curtain glazing that we see there to the foyers on the left. Again, an elevation that shows you what's happening inside to a degree, which is humanized by the gathering audience within the foyers. If we look at the plan at the bottom of the slide, you can see that Moro and his colleagues' love of octagons continues. Like the school at Leicester that we saw earlier, octagons are used consistently throughout this building. They form the basis of many of the room plans, the space plans, the whole auditorium. But they equally are found in such details as the columns in the foyers, which are similarly octagonal. So that kind of rigorous consistency ties everything together. Meanwhile, the auditorium there, a technical tour de force. There were two different factions on Plymouth City Council. One wanted a large theatre, the other a more modest space. Faced with both of these competing demands, the design team came up with the idea of a ceiling which could be dropped. In its upper position, you see the space here with 3 levels, but the ceiling can be wound down to screen off the upper level, creating a more intimate, smaller auditorium, which nonetheless always feels complete. However, Plymouth was really to be the last of the practice's major theatres. By the early 1980s, this line of work was also drying up, just like the council housing around this same time. The Talizan Arts Centre at Swansea University was to be their final project in this area, again, rigorously geometric, as you see here. Moro retired, the practice subsequently closed. Almost all of its work had been in the public sector. That had perhaps been a strength during the boom years of the public sector welfare state in the 60s. But with the political retrenchment of the 1980s, that became more problematic. But to conclude, the work of Moro and his colleagues demonstrates the opportunities available in mid-century Britain to a small creative practice, working with enlightened clients, and which was connected into important professional networks. The buildings that resulted from this have long been recognised as being of significance. They attracted contemporary acclaim. Meanwhile, the Festival Hall, Moro's house at Blackheath, and the Nottingham Playhouse were all among the first post-war buildings to be listed as being of significance in the late 1980s and early 90s. So then, this is an important body of work, one which demonstrates that modern architecture could be shaped by more than functional considerations alone. It's a body of work which I have enjoyed researching and writing about. So thank you very much for also giving me the opportunity to talk to you about it this evening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alistair. That was hugely interesting and entertaining and engaging all in one. Many, many thanks. Now I'm looking at the time and there's at least one question coming in and I suspect more. What I suggest you do, Alistair, if you stop screen sharing and I will highlight you and also Alan, spotlight for everyone. And where's Alan?
Hello.
Yes, hold on a second. Add spotlight. There we go. All right. And as I say, I mean, I could start with the first question, but Alan, I suspect you have things you'd like to say first.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Alistair. I wonder though whether we could have that last slide up with the district information, just to point it out to people.
Let me see if I can get it back.
We would love you to take advantage of this quite generous offer by Liverpool University Press for about 1/3 off the price of the book. I think you get it for £21. And it's a fairly simple little email. Maybe, Alistair, you could just read it out.
Yes, so bit.ly/C20 Peter Moro, all one word. And then when you get to checkout, the code is LUP30.
And if anybody didn't get that, then write to Insiders Outsiders and I can give you the details to you again. Very good.
Well, thank you very much. No, that's great.
Good. Yes. Well, what a fascinating figure he was, and how much he achieved with a fairly small practice.
Yes. I mean, I think that's one of the lessons of this whole series, actually, that these practices were often able to remain relatively small, and so much was achieved by these small groups.
Alistair, sorry to interrupt. Why don't you stop screen sharing again
Yes,
so we can
we've
concentrate
probably
on
got
the,
it.
on the two
Everyone's
of you.
seen the advert now. We can stop
Yeah.
stop the publicity. So there we go.
That's it, that's better.
Yeah.
Good.
Just one question before we go on to the one
Yeah.
from Charles Dallas and another one from John McKean. Peter Moro as an émigré, sort of that story faded out. And is that a true reflection, really, of his own feelings? Did he become anglicised, do you think?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm sure you actually will have met him. So in some respects, you may have an answer to this that I can't give. But he, to some extent, I think yes. I mean, I think he was always conscious of the fact that he'd come from Germany. His sister remained in Germany. In his interview for the British Library's Architects Live series in the early 90s, he said that, you know, his German was not what it was. He spoke to his sister in English, and she would sometimes answer in German and sometimes in English. So, you know, I think there was a degree to which, you know, he anglicised, if you want to see it like that. Though I'm sure, you know, his origins would have always been, you know, to some extent also important to him as well.
Yes, my impression was he had a sort of just that little bit of outsider edge that one
Yes.
can identify. And he was quite critical of many things. I think he had very decided opinions.
Absolutely. No, he after he retired, I think he described his occupation in Who's Who as writing rude letters to the architectural press. And although his own archive is not that extensive, there is some material at the RIBA. Some of those letters do survive. There are clippings from the likes of Building Design and the Architect's Journal, where he took aim at contemporary architecture and highlighted all the problems that he felt in contemporary architecture. And there's also a lively correspondence with Lubetkin. I mean, he maintained contact with Lubetkin, particularly in later life. And as Lubetkin again became better known in the 1980s through the work of John Allen and others, you know, that connection seems to have been firmly re-established, and the two of them had this quite entertaining correspondence where they would sort of look back on what they'd done together, but again also pick apart architectural questions, you know, things like symmetry, decoration, and these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Yes, someone with strong views. Yes, which is why I think I would have been terrified actually writing this if I'd known he could have read it, because I'm sure he would have probably disagreed with virtually everything that I've said.
I should also mention he wrote a very entertaining memoir, which
and that was
not published, but it's in the RIBA library, and in that he seems to have wanted to focus on telling funny stories, often against himself.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, the British Library interview is very similar, and you know, I imagine him to have been very entertaining company in many ways.
Have you looked at the questions in the chat?
Yes, so I saw the first question from Charles Dallas. Was the West Yorkshire Playhouse designed or influenced by Moro's designs? That's a really good question. So there are two Moro connections to the West Yorkshire Playhouse in Leeds. Moro was the chair of the judging panel, which selected the designer there in 1984. And the use of a competition for that project was unusual, actually. Most of Britain's post-war theatres were the result of direct approaches to particular architects or recommendations, but the Arts Council wanted to try the idea of a competition because they were concerned about what they felt was the poor design quality of some 1970s theatres, and they were encouraged in that direction by none other than Peter Moro, who went along to various Arts Council meetings and addressed the subject of architectural quality. So Moro chaired the judging panel, and the competition was won by Ian and Marjorie Appleton. And they came up, their design is very sort of reminiscent in its planning of some of the work of Moro's practice. It's got these kind of very strong polygonal geometries, and it's also very compact as well. And one of the reasons why it was favoured over many of its competitors was that it it was very efficient in the way that it was laid out. It seemed to really understand how theatres worked. And the link is that although Ian Appleton was based in Edinburgh by the early 1980s, he had worked with Moro at the end of the 60s. So there is a connection there. And I do wonder if Moro recognised a kind of kindred spirit, even if he wouldn't have quite known who the designer actually was. Visually, they're very different. Ian and Marjorie Appleton's design is in brick and represents what was known as the Leeds look by planners at the time, sort of evoking the Victorian brick architecture of Leeds. So it's I wouldn't say it was quite postmodern, but it's kind of tending in that direction more than Moro's own work. So I can see a question from John McKean as well. Hello, John. Thanks for this. Yeah, who did what? What were the roles of the partners and who led which project? This is a good question, and it's one that the lack of an archive complicates slightly. We don't necessarily have that information for certainly many of the earlier projects. Later on, as the different members of the design team started to be named in the periodicals to a greater degree, we have more sense of things. But by and large, the key people included Michael Mellish, who was fantastically helpful actually with my research, who joined Moro in 1954-55 after he'd done his national service. He was involved at Fairlawn School. He did a lot of the drawings for Blackheath Park, and he then tended to lead the Nottingham Playhouse he was important in too. Michael Mellish then tended to lead the housing jobs, and he was really overseeing that sequence of projects for the London Borough of Southwark. He then returned to theatres with the Talizan Theatre in Swansea. Other key people included Andrzej Blonsky and Michael Hurd, who tended to be more involved with the theatres and the arts buildings. And there were others. I mean, it's difficult to start naming some because I will then miss out others, and I apologise for that. And I mentioned that in the book as well. We don't quite have all of that information, but what we do know is something of the way that the practice worked, certainly in its later years, which is that Moro was there and obviously, you know, was involved and took an interest in what was going on, and was very good at unlocking the kind of the bits of the design that would make something really work. So if there was something that the team was struggling over or trying to get to kind of work out, Moro's ability was to kind of home in and go, why don't you do it like this? And invariably, that was then the key that made the scheme work. And you can see, you know, that's something that perhaps goes all the way back to his time at Regent Street when he was working with the students. And Trevor Dannett's recollection of Moro teaching him is that Moro was very demanding, but also, you know, was able to help the students through those sorts of things. So Moro was there, but as I say, in the later years, the others certainly had a kind of degree of autonomy. But what's interesting is that there were these shared preoccupations, particularly with geometry, which run through all of their work.
A question about your book on theatre design. Do you want to just give us?
Yes. This is an extended commercial break. I should have got a copy off the shelf behind me. But the book is called Modern Playhouses. That's the short title. It then goes An Architectural History of Britain's New Theatres, 1945 to 85. But if you look for Alistair Fair, Modern Playhouses, and it was published by Oxford University Press. The hardback is ruinously expensive, but the paperback comes in at about £30. And again, if anyone wants to email me at Edinburgh University, I have a code that I can give you, which will reduce the price of the paperback down even more.
Thank you. I wonder, could I ask one? Well, I've got lots of questions, but one in particular, just a very visual comparison. As I say, I'm not an expert, but I was struck. I think it was the Hilly showroom with the spiral staircase and that rope. Not really a balustrade, is it? But I suppose we can call it that. It reminded me very much of Two Willow Road, the Ernest Goldfinger building, which of course was much earlier. Yeah. And I wondered about connections possibly between the two men.
That's a good question. It's not something I've particularly picked up from what I've seen. But I mean, Alan, you're a Goldfinger specialist as well. Do you want to come in on this?
Yes, well, spiral staircases are quite a shared common possession, I think.
But it's the
the story that is interesting, though, is that the Juliuses,
yes,
who owned and ran Hilly, had employed Goldfinger to do their factory at Watford.
Yes.
And Corinne Julius, their daughter, came to speak at a Moro Day that we held, which John Allen and John McKean were also participants in. And she said they chose not to go back to Goldfinger because although they admired his work very much, it was rather hard work dealing with him. And they thought Peter Moro would be somewhat easier.
Interesting. I'd forgotten that connection. And the other is more of an observation. I mean, going back to Alan's original question about his self-awareness, perhaps as somebody from elsewhere, and particularly, you know, Jewish, if not consciously or practicing as a Jew, but nevertheless with that German Jewish sort of historical burden, you know, behind him. And I'm thinking, of course, that Lubetkin wasn't himself a refugee, but I think I'm right in saying, aren't I, Alan, that actually he lost his father who was killed in the Holocaust. I mean, his family suffered direct, profound losses in the Holocaust. And I just wonder, you said that Peter Moro's sister had remained in Germany. Was she ill-fated in that, you know, during the war? You know, is there more to it than meets the eye, in other words, in terms of a shared past between the two men, or a shared family sort of background?
Well, I think I can only call on John Allen.
Yes, I see John as well. John, do you want to come in on this?
John, may I highlight you so everybody can? Where's John gone?
Sorry, you'll have to repeat the question.
Right. Okay. Let me just make sure everybody can see you. I was just wondering about that sort of shared background of, you know, persecution as Jews, even if in Lubetkin's case he hadn't come as a refugee, but his family suffered very profoundly in the Holocaust, and whether Moro in fact ever talked about that aspect of his past.
He didn't really talk to me about that. I mean, I knew Peter quite well for quite a long time. I went to interview him, it must have been about 1970 or so. His practice was still down around the corner from Charlotte Street then. He was still, you know, at his desk, as it were. And then I used to see him fairly often, sometimes in company with Lubetkin. They didn't talk about their Jewish inheritance. I mean, I think those are two separate stories which one could talk about, but I certainly didn't witness them discussing it with each other. But I was going to offer a minor anecdote about Peter when he was still living in Berlin, which Alistair no doubt will be familiar about, when one day he went to the showrooms of the Mercedes car showrooms to meet a friend. He was due to meet a friend there, and they were going to go for a drink or something. While he was waiting around in the foyer, who should walk in but Adolf Hitler with a bunch of his henchmen. Hitler assumed that Peter Moro was an attendant in the showroom. He'd come to see whether his new Mercedes, some huge Mercedes which he'd ordered, whether it was ready for collection yet. Peter said he'd have to go to the next room. He wasn't able to tell him, but he recounted the story in such a way as to claim credit as being one of the very few Jewish people he knew that had told Adolf Hitler where to go, which I think he enjoyed being able to say that.
He obviously had a wonderful sense of humor, and I think that's probably a good point at which to end, because it's drawing quite late now, isn't it? Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Alan, and of course, John Allen, but particularly Alistair. That was truly, truly excellent.
Thank you very much.
Let me just perhaps end by saying, as you may have twigged, the event has been recorded, and the recording will be uploaded within a week or so, usually, onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, which I think you can find without too much trouble, on courtesy of Google. But though I say it myself, the YouTube channel has become a really quite rich repository for all manner of events, not all of them, of course, on architecture and design, but there are a fair number. And I'm glad John McKean was able to join us. He was part of an excellent session not so very long ago to mark the publication of a book on Walter Siegel. There's an excellent talk by Harriet Atkinson, a kind of more overview sort of talk of about the Festival of Britain. Alan, as I mentioned earlier, has both talked and chaired a number of other design and architecture related events. And apropos internment, one last question, and then we must let everybody go. Do you know which internment camp on the Isle of Man he was in?
Off the top of my head, I can't remember. He went through several camps. He was at, I think, Kempton Park briefly, then I think Huyton, and then the Isle of Man, but I can't remember off the top of my head exactly which one. Because
that's also a hugely interesting, morally murky episode, in British wartime history. And indeed, there are a lot of events. There's actually already a subsection on the YouTube channel on internment related topics, which some of you might like to check out for yourselves. Very good. So it's definitely supper time, I suspect. Thank you, everyone. I think some people have already had to leave us, but thank you, everyone, for being attentive listeners. And keep an eye also on the Insiders Outsiders festival.org website for future events. The next one's actually next week. I can't resist just plugging it. It's on a totally different subject, which I think just so shows the range of what we are embracing. It's by Charlotte Philby, who happens to be the granddaughter of the notorious Soviet spy, Kim Philby, and it's a novel she has published recently about the relationship between her grandfather and Edith Tudor Hart, who was a wonderful émigré photographer and a Soviet spy. So there you are. So that's next week on the 23rd. Good. Thank you very much again, particularly Alistair. It's been a great pleasure to have you with us. Okay, good night.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Absolutely. All the best.